When Elena and I married, it felt as though I had won the life lottery. She was dazzling, ambitious, and full of life. The kind of woman who could captivate an entire room with her laughter. I first met her while working as a security officer at a luxury hotel. She managed events with a grace and determination that made it impossible not to admire her. It wasn't long before admiration turned into love, and soon after, marriage. For the next 8 years, life seemed perfect. Elena's career as a high-end hospitality manager took her across Europe, while I transitioned from military service to running my own private security consulting firm. Together, we owned a beautiful home in Zurich, hosted elaborate dinner parties, and were the kind of couple others aspired to emulate. But perfection, as I learned, is often nothing more than a veneer. The cracks began to show in subtle ways. A faint whiff of cologne on her scarf that wasn't mine. A new perfume she casually claimed was a gift from the hotel. Late-night work calls became more frequent. Her affection became sporadic, and her smile, once so bright, grew distant. My instincts, honed from years of military service, screamed at me that something was wrong. Yet I hesitated. I didn't want to face what I feared might be true. That hesitation ended on a night that would forever alter the course of my life. Elena had just returned from a work trip to Milan. As she showered, her phone buzzed on the bedside table. The message on the screen froze me in place. Milan was unforgettable. Next time, let's not leave the bed at all. Missing you already, Andre. For days, I carried that message in the back of my mind, pretending everything was normal while the storm inside me grew. I couldn't act impulsively. I needed evidence, clarity, and a plan. That's when I reached out to a private investigator, someone I trusted from my military days. Within weeks, the truth was laid bare. Elena had been seeing Andre, a French luxury hotel executive, for over a year. This wasn't a fleeting fling. Andre lavished Elena with extravagant gifts, romantic getaways, and promises of a future. She even had a hidden savings account where Andre deposited money, a safety net for the life they were secretly building together. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. She lied with precision and planned her double life with care, while I remained blissfully unaware, pouring my energy into what I thought was our shared dream. It made my blood boil, but I didn't confront her immediately. Confrontation wouldn't satisfy me. It wouldn't make her feel the depth of my pain. No, I wanted her and Andre to experience something far worse than an argument. I wanted them to feel the weight of their choices in a way they'd never forget. Revenge isn't something you rush. I knew that from my years in the military. A poorly planned strike only leads to chaos. To truly dismantle Elena and Andre's fantasy world, I needed time, patience, and precision. While my anger burned like a wildfire, I forced myself to stay composed, playing the role of the loving, clueless husband. My first step was to gather every scrap of information I could. The investigator provided me with evidence that could tear their world apart. Photographs of clandestine meetings, receipts from luxury trips, and bank statements from her secret account. I compiled everything into a file, a damning testament to her betrayal. Elena remained oblivious to my plans. Each morning, I kissed her goodbye as she left for work. Each evening, I cooked dinner and asked about her day, pretending to hang on her every word. Behind my mask, I was methodically dismantling the life we had built together. That's when I brought Jonas into the picture. Jonas was an old combat buddy, a man who thrived on challenges, especially those requiring justice. When I told him what had happened, he didn't hesitate. "She betrayed you like that? All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's make sure they both pay." We spent weeks planning. The key was timing. Elena and Andre were arranging another business trip to a private villa near Milan. It was the perfect opportunity. Jonas had a contact in the area, a former operative who could gain access to the villa without raising suspicion. Everything was falling into place. While the plan took shape, I played my part to perfection. I helped Elena pack for her trip, even tucking a handwritten note into her suitcase. "For my love, always." She smiled when she found it, completely unaware of what awaited her. The night Elena and Andre arrived at the villa, Jonas and I were already nearby. From a hidden vantage point, we watched them lounge by the pool, sipping wine and laughing as if they had no care in the world. My anger flared, but I reminded myself to stay patient. The bartender, one of Jonas's local contacts, served Andre's favorite cocktail, laced with a powerful sedative. Within minutes, Andre's laughter turned into slurred words. His body slackened, and he collapsed onto the poolside lounger. Elena panicked, trying to help him up, but he was dead weight. That's when Jonas and I made our move. The villa was silent, save for the echo of our footsteps on the marble floor. Elena's face turned ashen the moment she saw me. "Marcus?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. Instead, Jonas and I hauled Andre to his feet like a rag doll. He was barely conscious, his head lolling to one side. Elena followed us, pleading. "Please, Marcus, let me explain," she cried. I stopped and turned to her, my voice cold. "The time for explanations is over." We dragged Andre into the grand living room, dumping him into a chair. Jonas secured him with military-grade restraints, ensuring he couldn't escape even if he regained full consciousness. I turned to Elena, who stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to cry," I said, my voice sharp. "You brought this on yourself." Andre stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Panic replaced the grogginess as he realized his predicament. "Good evening, Andre," I said, my tone dripping with venom.
"I'm Marcus."
"You've been sleeping with my wife." "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. Jonas handed me the bat, a simple, worn tool that felt heavy in my hands. I let its weight settle, savoring the moment. "You misunderstand, Andre," I said, stepping closer. "This isn't a conversation. This is a reckoning." I swung the bat down hard, not on him but on the table beside him. The glassware shattered, sending shards across the floor. Elena screamed, and Andre flinched, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I've given you both everything," I said, my voice steady but filled with fury. "And this is how you repay me?" Elena stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Marcus, please, this isn't who you are. You're better than this." I turned to her, my expression hard. "Don't you dare tell me who I am, Elena. You lost that right the moment you betrayed me." Andre tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. I swung the bat again, this time shattering the chair leg near his ankle. He screamed, the sound echoing through the villa. "Next time I won't miss," I said, leaning in close. "Do you know what kneecaps sound like when they break, Andre? I've heard it before." Jonas stepped forward, his massive presence amplifying the tension. "Or we could start lower," he said, nodding toward Andre's lap. "What do you think, Marcus?" I smiled grimly, letting the bat rest on the floor. The room was thick with tension, the only sound being Andre's ragged breathing and Elena's stifled sobs. Her hands trembled as she clutched the back of a nearby chair, her eyes darting between me, Jonas, and Andre. She wasn't sure which of us she should fear more. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice cracking, "I made a mistake. Please, don't do this." I turned to her slowly, letting my eyes pierce through the veil of lies she had spun for over a year. "A mistake," I repeated, my tone cold. "A mistake is spilling coffee on your blouse, Elena. What you did was deliberate, calculated. You don't get to minimize this." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "I never meant to hurt you." I let out a bitter laugh. "You never meant to hurt me? You lied to my face every single day for over a year. You planned trips, opened secret accounts, and built a life with another man while I was busy building one for us. Don't stand there and tell me this was an accident." She took a step forward, her hands outstretched as if to beg. "Please, Marcus, you have to believe me. I still love you." I raised the bat slightly and she froze in place. "Don't you dare say that," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "You don't know the meaning of love." Andre let out a whimper, drawing my attention back to him. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. He looked like a cornered animal, desperate and terrified. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know she was married. She told me." "Don't lie to me," I snapped, cutting him off. "You knew exactly who she was and who I was. Did you think you could just take what's mine without consequences?" He shook his head frantically.
¿Y suer? ¿Y?
I swung the bat again, this time shattering a vase on the table next to him. The sound of breaking glass made him flinch violently. "You don't get to talk," I said. "Not until I say so." Jonas stepped forward, his presence looming over Andre like a shadow. "You think this is bad?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "This is nothing compared to what we've seen, compared to what we're capable of." Andre whimpered, his entire body shaking. He was pathetic, a far cry from the confident, suave man who had stolen my wife. The sight of him like this should have satisfied me, but it didn't. Not yet. I turned back to Elena, who stood frozen, tears streaking her cheeks. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I asked her. "You've destroyed everything. Our life, our trust, everything we built together." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But, you're right," I interrupted. "You don't." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folder of evidence I had compiled. The photographs, bank statements, and messages that exposed her betrayal in excruciating detail. I tossed it onto the floor in front of her, the contents spilling out like the shattered remains of our marriage. "Look at it," I said. "Look at what you've done." Elena dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she picked up the papers. Her sobs grew louder as she flipped through the pages, each one a damning reminder of her actions. "Do you feel guilty now?" I asked. "Or are you just upset because you got caught?" She didn't answer. She just sat there, clutching the evidence of her betrayal, her body racked with sobs. For a moment, I almost felt pity for her. Almost. But then I remembered the nights I spent lying awake, wondering why she had grown so distant. I remembered the pain of discovering her lies and the humiliation of knowing she had chosen someone else over me. That pity evaporated, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. I nodded to Jonas, who untied Andre from the chair and yanked him to his feet. He was unsteady, his legs barely holding him up. "Leave," I commanded, my voice like ice. "Both of you, and if I ever see either of you again, there won't be a warning. Just consequences." Elena hesitated, her tear-filled eyes searching mine as if looking for a trace of the man she had once loved. But that man was gone. "Go," I said, my voice firm. "Now." Jonas shoved Andre toward the door, and Elena followed, her steps hesitant and unsteady. They disappeared into the night, leaving the villa eerily silent. I stood there for a long time, staring at the mess they had left behind. The shattered glass, the broken furniture. It all felt symbolic of the life I had just dismantled. But instead of despair, I felt a strange sense of relief. The facade was gone, and with it, the weight of her betrayal. The silence of the villa lingered long after Elena and Andre had disappeared into the night. I stood in the center of the grand living room, staring at the chaos left behind. Broken glass, shattered furniture, and the faint scent of betrayal still hung in the air. But I didn't feel regret. If anything, I felt clarity, like a heavy fog had lifted, revealing the truth of my life. Jonas placed a hand on my shoulder, his steady presence grounding me. "What's the next step?" he asked, his voice calm but resolute. "The next step," I said, my voice cold, "is to erase every trace of her from my life." The drive back to Zurich felt like the longest journey of my life, but it gave me time to think. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. Determined to take back the life I had built and ensure Elena and Andre felt the full weight of their choices. They didn't just betray me. They tried to take my future, my dignity, and everything I held dear. But now I held the power. The next morning, I began dismantling the life Elena and I had created together. The first step was the house. It had always been her dream. A sprawling property with high ceilings, designer furniture, and a meticulously manicured garden. But to me it was now just a hollow shell. I called the realtor and put it on the market, instructing them to expedite the sale. Within days it was listed and offers began pouring in. Next, I froze our joint accounts. Elena had no idea that I had quietly transferred the majority of our savings into a separate account months earlier, suspecting something was wrong. By the time she tried to access the money, it was too late. Her credit cards were declined, her lavish lifestyle abruptly cut off. I imagined her panic when she realized she no longer had access to the funds she had relied on. But that wasn't enough. I wanted Andre to feel the consequences as well. Using the evidence the private investigator had gathered, I compiled an anonymous dossier and sent it to Andre's employer. It contained details of his affair with Elena, misuse of company resources for personal trips, and questionable financial dealings. Within weeks, whispers of his misconduct spread through the industry, and his reputation began to crumble. The luxury hotels that had once vied for his attention now wanted nothing to do with him. Elena didn't fare much better. Word of her betrayal spread quickly, fueled by strategic leaks to her professional network. Colleagues began to distance themselves, and clients pulled out of events she was organizing. The glamorous, high-profile life she had worked so hard to maintain unraveled piece by piece. She moved into a small apartment in Zurich, far from the luxurious lifestyle she had once flaunted. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding. I threw myself into my work, expanding my security consulting firm and taking on new, high-profile clients. The company thrived, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of purpose again. But even as my professional life flourished, the emotional scars remained. Betrayal, I realized, wasn't something you could simply forget. It left a mark that no amount of success could erase. One evening, as I sorted through old photographs, I found a picture of Elena and me on our wedding day. She looked radiant, her smile full of promise and hope. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman I had married with the one who had betrayed me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bridge the gap. The Elena I had loved no longer existed. I took the photo and placed it in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. The past, I decided, would stay in the past. It was time to move forward. Months passed, and with each day, the distance between me and the life I had shared with Elena grew wider. The chaos of betrayal had settled into a quieter resolve, and while the scars remained, they no longer bled. I had begun to rebuild, brick by brick, and the life I was crafting felt stronger, more grounded. But just as I began to feel the first glimmers of peace, a letter arrived. It was a simple envelope, unmarked except for my name written in elegant, familiar handwriting. For a moment, I considered throwing it away without opening it. What could Elena possibly say that I hadn't already heard or seen? But curiosity won out, and I unfolded the letter. Marcus, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I owe you an apology not for being caught but for taking you for granted. For breaking the trust you placed in me and for destroying the life we built together. I know words mean nothing after what I've done, but I need you to know that I regret it. Every day I regret it. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me love, stability, and a home, and I threw it all away because I was too selfish to see what I had. I thought I wanted something more, something exciting, but all I found was emptiness. Andre is gone, and so is the life I thought I wanted. And now, all I have left are the consequences of my choices. I envy the strength you've found, the way you've moved on and rebuilt yourself. I see it in the whispers I hear about your success, in the way people talk about you with admiration. You're stronger than I ever was, and I'll carry the guilt of knowing I was the one who tried to break you. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect a response. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I've lost, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life.
Elena.
I read the letter twice, each word sinking in like a stone dropped into a still pond. She was right, her words meant nothing now. They couldn't undo the betrayal, the pain, or the humiliation. They couldn't rebuild what she had destroyed. And yet, a part of me felt a strange, bittersweet satisfaction. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because she finally understood the magnitude of what she had done. I folded the letter carefully and held it over the fireplace. The flames licked at the edges before consuming it entirely, reducing it to ash. Some doors, I realized, are meant to stay closed. That night, I found myself on the shores of Lake Geneva, watching the sunset paint the water in hues of gold and crimson. The chaos of the past year felt like a distant memory, though its lessons lingered. Betrayal, I realized, might break you, but how you rebuild defines you. And I had rebuilt myself into someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Time continued to move forward, but the echoes of Elena's betrayal remained, faint but ever present. There were moments when her memory crept in unexpectedly. When I walked past the cafe where we used to spend Sunday mornings, or saw a couple laughing together in a way that reminded me of what we once had. These moments weren't painful anymore, but they carried a lingering weight, like shadows that refused to fully fade. Jonas stayed in touch as he always had. He was more than a friend. He was a reminder of who I used to be before betrayal reshaped me. One evening, he called me out of the blue. "How's life treating you these days?" he asked. "Quiet," I replied. "That's not a bad thing." "Good. Quiet suits you," he said. But there was a hesitation in his voice, a tone I recognized immediately. "What is it?" I asked, my instincts flaring. Jonas wasn't the kind of man to hesitate. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this," he began. "But you deserve to know. I heard something about Elena." My grip on the phone tightened. "What about her?" "She's been trying to get her career back on track. Rumor has it she's applied for a job at one of the luxury hotels you consult for." The words hung in the air between us. My first instinct was anger. A sharp, searing flash that reminded me of the man I'd been when this all started. But that anger was quickly replaced by something colder, calculated. Elena's life was her own to rebuild. But if she thought she could step into my world again, she was mistaken. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, my voice calm. "I'll handle it." Over the next few days, I dug into the details. Jonas had been right. Elena had applied for a position at a high-end hotel in Geneva, one of my most prominent clients. The irony wasn't lost on me. After everything she had done, she was now attempting to claw her way back into a world that I had a hand in shaping. I scheduled a meeting with the hotel's executive team under the guise of discussing security protocols. As we went over the agenda, I casually brought up the hiring process. "I understand you're considering some new candidates," I said. "Mind if I take a look at the shortlist?" The HR director handed me a folder, and there it was, Elena's name, her resume meticulously crafted to downplay the gaps and scandals of the past year. But no amount of polishing could erase the truth. Not when I held the power to ensure it wasn't forgotten. I didn't need to say much. With a subtle but firm suggestion, I steered the conversation in a direction that made it clear Elena wasn't a good fit. My influence in the industry was significant, and while I didn't wield it often, this was a battle I wasn't willing to lose. By the end of the meeting, her name was quietly removed from consideration. As I left the hotel, I felt no guilt about what I'd done. Elena had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. This wasn't revenge. It was ensuring that the life I had rebuilt remained untouched by the shadows of the past. That evening, I stood on my balcony, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of closure. Elena's attempts to re-enter my world had failed, and I could finally put the final nail in the coffin of that chapter of my life. With Elena's attempt to infiltrate my professional life thwarted, I believed I could finally close that chapter for good. Life returned to its steady rhythm, each day bringing me further away from the chaos she had left in her wake. My business thrived, and my personal life began to feel less like a battlefield and more like an open field, ripe with possibilities. But life, as I had learned, has a way of revisiting unfinished chapters when you least expect it. One evening, I received a call from an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but something compelled me to pick up. "Marcus," a woman's voice said. It wasn't Elena's, but it carried a similar cadence, a familiarity that made me pause. "Who is this?" I asked, my tone cautious. My name is Claire, she said. I'm Andre's sister. That caught me off guard. For a moment I didn't respond, unsure of where this was going. Finally, I found my voice. What do you want? I know this is unexpected, she said, her tone measured. But I need to talk to you. It's about my brother. A part of me wanted to hang up immediately. Andre was a name I had tried to erase from my mind, just as I had with Elena. But curiosity and a lingering sense of unfinished business kept me on the line. What about him? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He's not in a good place, Claire said. After everything that happened, his life fell apart. He's been struggling to pick up the pieces, but he's not the same. I don't know all the details, but I know you had a hand in it. Her words carried no accusation, just a quiet acknowledgement of what she suspected to be true. I didn't deny it. What do you expect me to do about it? I asked. I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. I just thought you should know. Whatever happened between you, Elena, and Andre, it's left scars on all of you. I can see it in him, and I imagine you've felt it too. I remained silent, her words stirring something in me that I didn't want to confront. Finally, I spoke. Thank you for telling me, I said, but Andre's choices were his own. He knew exactly what he was doing. I understand, she said softly, but sometimes the weight of a mistake is heavier than you expect. Take care, Marcus. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. I told myself it didn't matter. Andre's fate wasn't my concern. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. But Claire's words lingered, her voice echoing in the quiet corners of my mind. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the envelope of documents I had kept, the evidence of Elena and Andre's betrayal. I hadn't looked at it in months, but now it felt like an unwanted presence, a reminder of a storm I thought I had weathered. I opened the envelope, flipping through the photos and bank statements, each one a dagger to the heart I had once carried. But instead of anger, I felt something else. Exhaustion. Revenge had brought me satisfaction, but it hadn't brought me peace. That part, I realized, I would have to find on my own. Days passed, but Claire's words stuck with me like a splinter beneath the skin. I told myself I had no obligation to care about Andre or Elena. They had made their choices, and I had every right to ensure they suffered the consequences. But there was a part of me, small and quiet, that wondered if holding on to this anger was doing more harm than good. One evening, I found myself sitting by the fireplace, the envelope of evidence resting on the table before me. The whiskey in my glass had long gone warm, and the fire crackled softly in the silence. I stared at the photos of Elena and Andre together, their smiles a cruel reminder of what had been taken from me. Jonas stopped by that night, unannounced as always. He had a habit of showing up when I least expected him, but often when I needed him the most. You look like you're wrestling with something, he said, grabbing a beer from the fridge before plopping down in the armchair across from me. Just thinking, I replied, not meeting his eyes. That's dangerous, he quipped, taking a swig of his beer. What's on your mind? I hesitated before answering. Do you ever wonder if we went too far? With Andre, Jonas raised an eyebrow. Too far? That guy waltzed into your life, tore it apart, and thought he'd walk away unscathed. We didn't break him, Marcus. He broke himself. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I know, but I can't shake the feeling that holding on to this anger is exhausting. It's like carrying a weight that never gets lighter. Jonas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Look, man, what you're feeling, that's normal. Revenge might feel good in the moment, but it doesn't fill the void. You have to let it go. Not for them, but for yourself. His words settled over me like a heavy blanket. Deep down, I knew he was right. Revenge had consumed me for so long that I hadn't allowed myself to truly heal. I had rebuilt my life on the surface, but the foundation was still cracked, held together by the brittle glue of anger and resentment. That night, after Jonas left, I made a decision. I gathered every piece of evidence, photos, bank statements, text messages, and fed them to the flames of the fireplace. The fire consumed them quickly, leaving behind only ash. As I watched the last remnants of that chapter of my life disappear, I felt a strange sense of relief, as though I had finally let go of a burden I didn't realize I was carrying. But closure, I realized, wasn't as simple as burning a few papers. There was still a part of me that needed answers. Not from Elena, not even from Andre, but from myself. I needed to understand why I had allowed their betrayal to define me for so long. Letting go of the evidence felt like shedding a layer of skin, but the scars beneath were still raw. The anger I had carried for so long had been my armor, and without it, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I knew I couldn't move forward without confronting the deeper questions I had avoided for months. Why had Elena's betrayal destroyed me so completely? And why had I let revenge become my identity? The next morning, I drove to a place I hadn't visited in years. A small cabin on the edge of a quiet lake, deep in the Swiss countryside. It was a retreat I had discovered during my military days, a place where I could think without distraction. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with a wood stove, a single bed, and a view of the water that seemed to stretch endlessly. I spent the first day in silence, staring out at the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the surface. Memories of Elena and our life together surfaced unbidden, each one accompanied by a pang of loss. I had loved her deeply, completely, and maybe that was the problem. I had given her everything, leaving nothing for myself. By the second day, the silence began to feel less oppressive. I started journaling, a habit I hadn't revisited since my military days. At first, the words came slowly, stilted and awkward, but soon they poured out in a torrent. I wrote about the good times, the laughter and love that had once defined our marriage. I wrote about the pain of her betrayal, the sleepless nights spent questioning my worth. And I wrote about the anger, the fire that had driven me to seek revenge, even as it consumed me from within. By the end of the week, the pages of the journal were filled with a messy, unfiltered account of everything I had been through. Reading it back, I realized something profound. My anger hadn't just been about Elena's betrayal. It had been about control. I had built my life around the idea that I could protect what mattered most. My home, my marriage, my future. When Elena's betrayal shattered that illusion, it felt like losing a battle I hadn't even known I was fighting. But life, I realized, wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't something to be conquered or controlled. It was messy and unpredictable, full of beauty and pain in equal measure. And perhaps the only way to truly heal was to accept that some things were beyond my control. On my final night at the cabin, I stood by the lake, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. The moon reflected off the water, casting a silver glow that felt almost otherworldly. I closed my eyes and let myself feel the weight of everything. Love, loss, anger, and acceptance. For the first time in months, I felt truly present, no longer haunted by the shadows of the past. The next morning, I packed my things and headed back to Zurich. The cabin had given me clarity, but I knew the real work of healing would begin now, in the life I had to return to. I wasn't the man I had been before Elena's betrayal, but that was okay. I didn't need to be. Returning to Zurich was like stepping back into a life that was familiar but fundamentally changed. The city streets bustled with life, the sound of trams humming along their tracks and the aroma of fresh coffee wafting from corner cafes. Yet I saw it all with new eyes. The anger and bitterness that had once clouded my vision were gone, replaced by something calmer, something closer to acceptance. The first thing I did upon returning was to focus on my business. The consulting firm I had built was thriving, but I realized that I had been pouring myself into work as a way to escape my emotions. Now I approached it differently. Instead of using it as a shield, I treated it as an opportunity to create something meaningful, not just for myself but for my team and the clients who relied on us. With that mindset, the business expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. I began taking on pro bono projects for causes I believed in, offering security expertise to charities and organizations that couldn't afford it otherwise. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about purpose. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was building something that truly mattered. An unexpected encounter. One afternoon, as I walked through the old town after a meeting, I stopped at a small cafe I used to frequent with Elena. The memories of our mornings there, sharing pastries and laughter, surfaced briefly, but they no longer stung. They were just moments from another life. I ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, watching the world go by. That's when I noticed her.
Elena.
She was sitting at a table across the street, alone. Her once polished appearance had softened. She wore a simple coat and scarf, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look almost unrecognizable. She was staring down at her phone, but there was a melancholy about her. A weight she carried in the way her shoulders slumped and her eyes seemed distant. For a moment, I considered leaving, but something held me in place. I wasn't angry anymore, and I didn't feel the need to confront her. But there was a part of me that was curious, not about her life now, but about how I would feel seeing her after everything. Before I could decide what to do, she looked up and spotted me. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, cautiously, she stood and walked over to the cafe, hesitating at the door before stepping inside. "Marcus," she said softly when she reached my table. "Elena," I replied, my voice calm. "Do you mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the chair across from me. I nodded. "Go ahead." She sat down, clasping her hands together on the table. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke. "I wasn't expecting to see you," she said. "You look good." "Thank you," I replied. "You do too." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I heard about your business. It seems like you're doing well." "I am," I said simply. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. "Marcus, I don't know if this means anything to you, but I really am sorry. For everything." "I know," I said, and I meant it. I could see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice. She had paid her price, just as I had paid mine. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, just polite conversation that felt almost surreal given our history. When she stood to leave, she paused, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad you're doing well," she said. "You deserve it." "You too," I replied, and for the first time I meant that as well. She walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and I felt no urge to follow. Seeing her again didn't reopen old wounds. It closed them. It reminded me that the person I had been, the man who had loved her and been betrayed by her, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone who had learned to find peace not in revenge, but in letting go. As the weeks passed after my brief encounter with Elena, I found myself reflecting not on the pain of the past, but on the journey I had taken to get here. Life no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a story, a messy, imperfect, but ultimately meaningful story. And for the first time in what felt like years, I was ready to turn the page. A new beginning. One crisp autumn morning, I found myself standing on the shores of Lake Geneva. The water stretched out before me, shimmering under the golden light of the rising sun. It was the same spot where I had stood months ago, grappling with the weight of betrayal and the anger that had consumed me. But this time the lake felt different, peaceful, inviting. I had come here not to dwell on the past, but to celebrate the present. Over the last year, I had rebuilt my life into something I could be proud of, not out of spite or revenge, but out of a genuine desire to live fully. My business had flourished, my friendships had deepened, and I had discovered a newfound appreciation for the quiet, simple moments of life. I wasn't the same man who had been shattered by Elena's betrayal. That man had been forged into someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient. And while the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined me. They were simply a part of my story, a reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. The unexpected visitor. As I stood by the lake, lost in thought, I heard footsteps approaching. Turning, I saw Jonas walking toward me, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. He gave me a lopsided grin as he stopped beside me. "Couldn't resist checking up on you," he said, his tone light. "I'm fine," I replied, smiling. "Better than fine, actually." "Yeah, I can see that," he said, his eyes scanning the lake. You've come a long way, Marcus. We stood in silence for a while, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze. Finally, Jonas spoke again. You know, he said, I think the old you would have handled this differently. Probably would have let that anger eat you alive. I nodded. The old me did let it. For a while anyway. But revenge doesn't heal wounds. It just deepens them. Jonas glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. So, what's next for you? I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. I don't know, I admitted. But I'm okay with that. For the first time in a long time, I'm okay with not knowing. He grinned. That's growth, my friend. A letter to myself. That evening, back in Zurich, I sat down at my desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. For months, I had been journaling to make sense of my emotions, but this time felt different. This time, I wasn't writing to process anger or pain. I was writing to acknowledge how far I had come. Dear Marcus, you made it. You survived the betrayal, the anger, and the chaos. You've rebuilt your life, not as a reaction to what happened, but as a testament to who you are. You're stronger now, not because you sought revenge, but because you chose to let go. You chose to heal. The scars will always be there, but they don't define you. They're just part of your story, a story that's still being written. And the best part? You're the one holding the pen. So live boldly, love deeply, and never forget that the man you've become is someone worth fighting for. With pride, yourself. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, knowing I'd likely never read it again. It wasn't about keeping the words, it was about acknowledging the journey. The horizon ahead. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong drifting through the open window. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting warm patterns on the walls. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Not just from Elena or Andre, but from the weight of everything that had held me back. As I sipped my coffee and gazed out at the city below, I realized I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I had found it, and with it, a sense of excitement for the unknown future ahead. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was mine, and that was enough.